Good morning and welcome to Mindset Mondays with DTK. This is episode number 161 in an ongoing series of live broadcasts designed for folk who've already realized that the best way to get better at doing what you do is to get better at being who you be, right? To peel off everything that isn't true, isn't you, and live, lead, and love from there. So, if you'll take just a moment and click share just below this video and invite your audience, your tribe, your colleagues to join the conversation. And remember, we're live on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and even Clubhouse. So thank you for joining in. Good morning, Kevin and Parisa. I've got folks already on different platforms joining in this morning. Whew. So this has been a fascinating week. Those of you who get the email will notice the emails didn't go out. Part technology, part me. So, ta-da! So today, it's a mystery. So part of what we're playing with is I realized as I was playing with the quote you're going to see in just a moment that I live in sort of a fascinating dichotomy, right? I am a sponge. I'm a lifelong learner. I am a mastery junkie. I am consciously and constantly diving in, always willing to dive deep. I'm even prone to over yesing, um, which leads to some seriously overloaded stretches on my calendar. Um, Back in 2016, I had said yes to a training and certification in a program called Conversational Intelligence. I had committed to being in the first cohort of certification for Team Coaching International's Certified Team Performance Coach program. I had been working with their content since 2010. They were the first ones to offer a certification in true team coaching, team only assessment. And I was also part of uh, what do you call it, a pilot study on coaching with ROI. In other words, weaving in calculations of return on investment from the very first conversation about coaching with individuals and with organizations. So all three of these are right up my alley, things that I was incredibly motivated by and interested in and ready to dive deep. And when they finally set the schedule for each of them, they all started within a week of each other. So I ended up in three full-on deep dive programs, two of them towards certification at the same time, and my brain exploded. And as typical, that was one of my moments of chronic over yesing. Instead of saying, whoa, 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 these are all hell yes content areas, but they can't all be right now. Um, I decided I was going to make it work. Um, I wouldn't say to my peril, but to the peril of my ability to participate fully in the ROI piece, which I had to come back and do later. And that's one of those times where that yearning to dive deep took precedence over my yearning for any sense of flow or rhythm in my world. Um, and at one point, somewhere in the middle of that, I chose to swear off collecting letters after my name. I also realized that by the time that those two certification programs were over, I was going to have exactly the same number of letters after my name as I do in my name, and that includes the hyphen. So that was, I had to stop. Um, but the dichotomy comes in here. I'm also a rule breaker. I don't like them. I don't like being constrained by them, and I don't think they apply to me. Just ask my mom. I'm a firm believer that rules are there to be broken. Um, I don't think they should apply, except I even do tend to get cranky when other people don't follow the rules. Driving with me can be a challenge. But the question is, how do I resolve that conflict? How do I resolve that inherent paradox? And this is how. Um, there's a Tblisi-born author named Tamuna Tsertsvadze, and I'm blown away by this quote. The idea that only those who actually know the rules may break them. And although I may argue with the concept, with some of the phrasing that may be able to break them, I'm going to say that only those who know the rules can break them well. And that's where I live. The better I know the rules, the better I understand the structures, the more mastery I have of the craft, the better I can break those rules in service of my gifts, the better I can serve my purpose and my tribe. The better you know the rules, the better you can break them in service of your growth, your purpose, and your tribes. And what's coming clear is entrepreneurs break rules, leaders break rules. I break rules. So, what I'm curious about is how do you break the rules? Where do you break the rules? Right? How does this rule breaking idea show up for you? I mean, as I'm looking at the folks in the audience, Dorothy, Kevin, Marcella, Lisa, and Parisa, I know I know each of you, and those are the ones I can see because you've commented so far, um, have an affection for breaking the rules, each in your way. Um, so I'm super curious. How do you break the rules? And in service of what? You know, our friend Shelley Paxton talks about rather than being a rebel against something, being a rebel for something, right? And I think there's a distinction here. Breaking the rules. Thanks, Lawrence. My brother-in-law, who's a mediator and recovering attorney, says, I break rules, court sanctions to follow. That's the playground here is how do you see rules? How do you break rules? And what is it in service of? Dorothy says, people always ask me why I have to ask why. Why would one ever stop asking why? And for the sake of what? I always say, why don't you ask why more? Nice question, Dorothy. And here's the playground. How is it that you're breaking rules and what is it in service of? Right? For me, I look at rules for the sake of rules, particularly rules that are merely for the sake of having rules, I find offensively constraining because they're structure just for the sake of structure. And yes, I do understand that there are times where I don't yet see what the purpose of the rule is, and I don't care. Um, I've always wanted to know why the rule is in place and what the origin, what the need for the rule is. I'm not one to sit and wait and do the wax on, wax off and wait to understand why later. That's a problem for me because I have an insatiable desire to understand. And so that has caused problems for me. You know, Lisa says, being a nonconformist my whole life, dare to be different. But to what service? I hope to have that much intent always. But that's the question. It's what is it in service of? I like the prompt from Shelley, not raging against something, but breaking them in favor of creating something. You know, I think that, and God, I wish I could remember who said it, but the idea that all creation comes from and, if not requires, destruction. The breaking of rules, the breaking of norms, the breaking of the status quo to create something new. How can you create? How can you create something new without violating the status quo, without cutting through bureaucracy? Thanks, Sherry. Dorothy says, Kevin, my own bias is to want things to be better, even if they seem ideal right now. I love that, Dorothy, because even though the status quo may be ideal, what if it could be idealer? Yeah, I know idealer isn't a word. What if it could be more ideal? What if it could, what if it could address more systemic ills instead of being ideal in this footprint, be ideal in a wider footprint? Yeah, Marcella, as an active attorney and coach, you're in a dance, and Marcella said very carefully because I'm a lawyer and I know the consequences. But knowing the consequences and knowing the rules and knowing the boundaries, you know where to push up against them. It's fascinating when kids know what the rules are, when they know what the boundaries are, when they know what the constraints are, they have something to push up against, if not pound the edges of and push outside of. So when they don't know the rules, they'll break them, they'll act out wildly, seeking to find where the edges of the container are. It's a natural thing for humans to push at the edges of our container. But we have to know what the container is. We have to know what the boundaries are. We have to know what the rules are in order to be choiceful, in order to be intentional about whether we live by those rules, we respect the edges of the container, or my way of respecting the edges of the container is to find the ways to violate those edges in service of something bigger, better, faster, more, in service of a purpose. It says, I find it interesting that lawyers today talk about sanctions for breaking rules. I was attracted to law briefly because I love the challenge of reframing an argument. My mom used to say to me when we had an argument, if it got to the point where she felt that the argument wasn't going in a way that aligned with her desired outcome, she would say, "You should be a lawyer when you grow up." And although I don't think it was meant as a compliment, I love that idea that it's being able to have an incredibly well-structured argument to it either to either reinforce the rules or break them. And that's it. It's being intentional and choiceful, decisive about your relationship with rules. Ooh, Sherry says there's a difference between a rule and a law. Sherry, I have to unpack that one. That could be like 5 more hours on here. I love that idea. The difference between a rule and a law, I gather, is who holds it and what the sanctions are, what the consequences are attached to it. I always say that in order to work in a system, you have to understand the system. Then you can fix it. Well, there's what a fascinating idea of sometimes to fix the system, one has to break the rules. Certainly one may have to break the norms because that which is accepted becomes the new norm. And there's so many times in which the norms have to be violated, have to be broken in order to fix the system. But isn't that essentially what coaching is enabling folk to understand what those unwritten rules are by which they are living in order for them to be intentional, to be decisive, to decide which of those rules they wish to break and which of those rules they wish to encode and enforce. I'm fascinated by how many of the things that the rules by which I live my or have lived my life have been the unwritten rules. You know, in my 20s, it was if I worked harder, if I worked longer, God knows I'm wicked smart. I can figure this out. It'll be better. So working harder and working longer, not smarter and more aligned and more authentic. It was just this unwritten rule that working harder and working longer, that was how to succeed. There was these unwritten rules that you had to pound it for a decade to get there so that you can then turn your attention on the personal side. Yeah, those unwritten rules didn't serve. Those broke or pushed up against and challenged my values. You know, we had several comments along here that talked about the difference between a rule and a law, or the difference between a rule and a social norm. There are also differences between rules and internal agreements, between unwritten rules and internal agreements. And the internal battle we have against our own strictures and structures, those that we create for ourselves, those are the rules that get broken most. Think about how often people try to create new routines. These are the new rules by which I'll live my life. And then, we're breaking the unwritten rules we lived by before to put those into place. That's what's clicking for me now, that in order to create a new abnormal coming out of this pandemic, to create a new way of being, a new structure for our lives and our world, we have to break the norm that's been accepted by us for the last year. Lots of conversations over this weekend about now that my wife and I have gotten the second vaccine and we're starting to look at what it's going to be like to reemerge, we get to have those conversations again about what are we getting to create going forward? Who do we want to be going forward? What do we want our worlds to look like going forward? What do we want our new abnormal to be like? What will the new rules be? I've created so many rules for living during this last year. What's safe, what's not, what I'm willing to do, what I'm comfortable doing. Ooh. I get to make new rules breaking these old ones. I'm fascinated by the choices that leaders are going to be making moving forward. What's the new path you're going to be creating this week, this month, this spring, this summer? As our world begins to emerge, however that looks moving forward right now, and next week, and next month, and next quarter, what do you want to create? What rules are you willing to break in order to create that? What rules are you creating so that you can break them? Go back to that idea. Only those who actually know the rules may break them. Unwritten rules don't fit. If they're unwritten, you don't know them. The first place for you to lean in, the first place for you to dive deep, the first place for you to seek mastery is the deepest pool you have to swim in. It's the relationship with yourself. It's diving into what are the rules you hold, what are the rules you're creating, be they written or unwritten, and evaluate them. What are they in service of? Break them. What would breaking them be in service of? Dive in, dive deep. It's time for mastery. What happens when you look inside for your place to seek mastery instead of more letters after your name? Yes, I'm a huge proponent of getting the training, getting the certification, learning the rules. How do you get trained and certified? In you. What would those letters look like? Well, I guess the way you see how my name is displayed here on the screen, I guess those letters come before my name. That's the DTK. No, I haven't reached mastery, and nor have I suspect many of you. But that's my invitation. Seek mastery on the deepest pool you have to dive into, to dive deep in, to seek mastery in. You, your rules, written and unwritten. Which ones will you cleave fast to? Which ones will you hold and own? Which ones will you break? And what is all of that in service to? So Elaine, that's a challenge for us this week. Elaine said, my wife says, I want another word for mastery. Oh, that's a fun sandbox to play in. Let's. So between now and next week, playground for you is, what rules are you going to break? And what mindset will you choose?